In this video, I'm going to name great performances by bad quarterbacks. I just included any shitty quarterback that came to mind. This video is proof that even a blind squirrel can find a nut once in a while. Enjoy. Ryan Leaf, Week 12, 2000 versus Denver. We start off with the biggest draft bust in NFL and possibly sports history. Leaf spent 4 seasons in the NFL after being picked second overall in 1998. He finished his career with just 14 touchdowns and 36 interceptions. But on one day in 2000 versus the Broncos, he had it going, throwing for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. Of course, his team still lost, but for once, you couldn't blame Leaf for that. Jamarcus Russell, Week 16, 2008 versus Houston. One can't mention Ryan Leaf without also bringing up Jawalrus Russell, the terrible first overall pick from 2007. He finished his short 3-year NFL career with a paltry 18 touchdowns and 23 interceptions. But believe it or not, he actually had a great game late in the 2008 season versus a bad Houston defense, putting up an efficient 2 touchdowns on 75% completion percentage in an 11-point win, showing he actually had talent, but he just didn't work at it. Tim Couch, Week 16, 2001 versus Tennessee. Compared to Leaf and Russell, Tim Couch was actually pretty good, but he still finished his disappointing 5-year career with just 64 touchdowns to 67 interceptions after being picked first overall in 1999. That's not to say he didn't have some bright moments, such as his late 2001 game versus Tennessee, completing over 74% of his passes for 336 yards and 3 touchdowns for a stellar 137.3 rating. Cleveland needed every bit of it too, as they won 41-38. David Carr, Week 5, 2004 versus Minnesota. Derek's older brother was once picked first overall for the expansion Texans in 2002. Safe to say he didn't come close to living up to the hype, finishing his career with 65 touchdowns to 71 interceptions, but he was still capable of a good performance occasionally, such as his 2004 matchup versus Minnesota, where he threw for over 370 yards and 3 touchdowns with no interceptions. Of course, this being the expansion-era Texans, they still lost, but good effort nonetheless. Blaine Gabber, Week 1, 2012 versus Minnesota. Finding a good game for Gabbert was very difficult to do since he's a truly terrible quarterback. It's honestly a miracle he somehow found a way to last over a decade in the league. That being said, the former first-rounder had a very good game in the 2012 season opener versus Minnesota. He even threw a go-ahead touchdown pass with 20 seconds left, but his defense couldn't hold the lead, and he eventually lost in overtime. Tough scene. Jake Locker, Week 3, 2012 versus Detroit. Locker is one of the most forgotten about bad quarterbacks in recent memory. Like Gabbert, he was drafted in the first round in 2011 and quickly flamed out, finishing his injury-filled 4-year career with 27 touchdowns to 22 interceptions. Still, he gave Titans fans one memorable performance early in 2012 against the Lions, a 44-41 thriller where he threw for almost 380 yards and 2 touchdowns. Of course, the very next week, he got hurt and missed 6 games. The quintessential Jake Locker story. Christian Ponder, Week 7, 2012 versus Green Bay. Well, what do we have here? Just another awful first-round quarterback from 2011. Like Locker, Ponder played 4 shitty years in the league before washing out. He did have one shining moment late in 2012, though, dicing up Green Bay's defense for 3 touchdown passes and a 37-34 win to help Minnesota secure a playoff spot. Of course, most of Ponder's contribution in 2012 was watching Adrian Peterson do the heavy lifting, but on this day he showed up. How the hell did this scrub get a babe like Sam Ponder? Joey Harrington, Week 7, 2004 versus the Giants. Good old Joey Harrington spent 6 crappy years in the NFL, but he's most famous for his disgustingly bad tenure in Detroit, where he played for 4 years after being drafted 3rd overall. Harrington's tenure with the Lions brought much sadness, but for one weekend in 2004, he lived up to the hype, slicing up the Giants' defense, completing almost 82% of his passes for 2 touchdowns and no picks and a 15-point road win. The Giants' defensive coordinator should be ashamed, to be honest. Brady Quinn, Week 11, 2009 versus Detroit. Brady Quinn remains one of the most handsome quarterbacks in NFL history. Unfortunately, this former first-rounder happened to be complete dog shit at actually playing the position. He finished his dreadful NFL career with just 12 touchdowns to 17 interceptions, which makes it all the more incredible that he was able to throw for over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns in one game versus Detroit in 2009. Again, this was the lowly Detroit defense he carved up, but still. In true Browns fashion, of course, they still lost, wasting a great performance from Quinn. Brandon Whedon, Week 16, 2015 versus Tennessee. Much like Brady Quinn before him, Whedon was drafted 22nd overall by the Browns to end their quarterback woes. Sadly, he would continue to be just another scrub quarterback in a long line of scrub quarterbacks for Cleveland. Cleveland cut bait after just 2 years, and Whedon bounced around the league for a few more years afterwards. He somehow pulled this good performance out of his ass late in 2015 for the Texans, throwing for 2 touchdowns and rushing for another in a blowout win, any given Sunday. Johnny Manziel, Week 2, 2015 versus Tennessee. Can you believe the Browns managed to draft 3 quarterback busts with the 22nd overall pick in an 8-year span? Well, they did. And Manziel is the final piece of that shit trifecta. Johnny Football was too concerned about partying to focus on actually playing football, but even in between all the late nights, he managed to squeak out a nice performance early in 2015 versus Tennessee. 2 touchdowns, no picks, and a stellar 133.9 rating. He finished his brief NFL career with just 7 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. Walter Payton has more career touchdown passes. Sam Darnold, Week 12, 2019 versus Oakland. Darnold is the most recent entrant on this list, which tells you just how awful he's been in such a short amount of time. The former 3rd overall pick has 54 touchdowns to 52 interceptions in the most pass-friendly era in history. He sucks, but on one weekend in 2019 versus a terrible Oakland defense, he teased Jets fans into thinking maybe he could be good one day, throwing for an efficient 315 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no picks with a rushing touchdown in a 31-point win. Maybe his mono temporarily gave him superpowers. Matt Leinart, Week 11, 2006 versus Detroit. Oh look, it's just another shitty quarterback draft bust from USC. Leinart had a legendary college career, but his NFL career was extremely forgettable. In 7 seasons, spent mostly as a backup, he finished with just 15 touchdowns to 21 interceptions, but he at least had one good performance as a rookie against a terrible Detroit team, throwing for over 230 yards and accounting for 2 touchdowns in a 17-10 win. I think Arizona was expecting a little more than this though when they got him in 2006. Mark Sanchez, the divisional round 2010 versus New England. Do we have another highly drafted bust from USC here? Yes, we do. Mark Sanchez was a terrible quarterback who was blessed with elite defense to carry him his first few years before becoming a journeyman who finished his career with more interceptions than touchdowns. However, he had one performance that every American should be grateful for, and that was his stellar 3-touchdown, 0-interception game in the Jets' famous upset win over New England in the 2010 playoffs. Not many quarterbacks have had a better single-game peak than that. Gino Smith, Week 17, 2014 versus Miami. When it became obvious that the Mark Sanchez experiment had run its course, the Jets decided to draft Gino Smith as their franchise quarterback in the 2nd round in 2013. He has been largely awful during his time in the NFL, currently holding career marks of 34 touchdowns and 37 interceptions, but he had one stellar performance in a meaningless Week 17 game versus Miami in 2014, throwing for over 350 yards, 3 touchdowns, and no interceptions for a perfect 158.3 passer rating in a 37-24 win. That's so Jets. Kyle Bowler, Week 15, 2005 versus Green Bay. Bowler was drafted by the Ravens in the 1st round in 2003 with the hope of finally giving the team a competent signal caller to pair with their elite defense. It didn't work out. Bowler was a complete flop and finished his shitty NFL career with 48 touchdowns to 54 interceptions. However, he had a stellar performance in 2005 against a bad Packers team, throwing for over 250 yards, 3 touchdowns, and no interceptions in a 45-point blowout win on Monday Night Football. He might have been a bad quarterback, but he's handsome and rich. Poor guy. Jimmy Claussen, Week 15, 2010 versus Arizona. Of all the entries on this list, Claussen's might be the weakest, but that just goes to show how awful he was in the NFL. He was a high school phenom destined for greatness, but after a good, not great career at Notre Dame, he was drafted in the 2nd round by Carolina in 2010 and completely bombed. He finished his NFL career with 7 touchdowns to 14 interceptions. At least on this one day, he wasn't horrible versus a bad Arizona team. Sure, he put up game manager numbers and not a lot of volume, but by his standards, it was excellent. Rick Meyer, Week 2, 1994 versus the Raiders. Another Notre Dame quarterback bust. Meyer was drafted 2nd overall in 1993 and hyped up as the next Joe Montana. This label is what enabled him to play for so long in the league despite consistently being dog shit, as teams kept waiting for him to break out. Nonetheless, he finished his career with 50 touchdowns to 76 interceptions. The fact that he once had 242 yards and 3 touchdowns for a 140.2 rating in a 29-point win versus the Raiders in 1994 shows you the football is truly the most unpredictable sport imaginable. Desean Kaiser, Week 17, 2017 versus Pittsburgh. Yet another awful Notre Dame quarterback. Kaiser was the starting quarterback of the infamous 2017 Browns squad who went 0-16. Kaiser started 15 games for the club, and, not surprisingly, it's the only time he ever saw important playing time in the league. He finished his career with just 11 touchdowns to 24 interceptions. However, Cleveland almost avoided the winless season, as in the final week of 2017 in a game against Pittsburgh's backups, Kaiser threw for over 300 yards and 2 touchdowns and ran for 61 more yards. The Browns lost by 4, of course, because they're the Browns. Chad Henny, Week 5, 2009 versus the Jets. Henny is one of those quarterbacks who has somehow managed to stick around for 15 years in the league despite never once showing he had any capability of being a good player. However, he's still by far the best Michigan quarterback I've ever watched in the NFL. In his career, Henny has thrown 60 touchdowns to 63 interceptions, but at least he had one stellar performance, throwing for over 240 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a 130.4 rating in a 31-27 win against the number 1 ranked Jets defense in 2009. Todd Moranovich, Week 17, 1991 versus Kansas City. Moranovich is famous for being bred to be an NFL NFL quarterback from birth, although technically his controlling father's desires did come true. As Moranovich made the NFL, he would wash out quickly, finishing with just 8 touchdowns to 9 interceptions in his 2-year career. He did have one good performance in a meaningless Week 17 game versus Kansas City his rookie year, throwing for 3 touchdowns and no picks in a 27-21 loss. The very next week, he would start a playoff game against those same Chiefs and throw 4 interceptions in a 10-6 loss. Sucks to suck. Rex Grossman, Week 2, 2006 versus Detroit. That's right, folks, the sex canon makes this list. Grossman is most famous for his wildly entertaining and inconsistent 2006 season with Chicago, where he was mostly carried to a Super Bowl appearance by his elite defense. However, that's not to say Sexy Rexy never did his part. He played a near-perfect game early in the season against a lowly Detroit team, completing almost 75% of his passes for 4 touchdowns and a 148 rating in an easy 34-7 win. Brock Osweiler, Week 17, 2017 versus Indianapolis. Brock Osweiler made millions of dollars sitting behind Peyton Manning in Denver for 4 years. Then he made more millions playing like shit for 1 year in Houston. Then he went back to Denver in 2017, where on one night, in a game he didn't even start, he put up a stellar 147.7 rating, 2 passing touchdowns and a rushing touchdown in a 25-13 win over Indy. Osweiler finished his largely crappy NFL career with 37 touchdowns and 31 interceptions. However, he did win a Super Bowl ring in 2015, so I guess he's a winner. Heath Shuler, Week 4, 1997 versus Detroit. Like Peyton Manning, Heath Shuler had a stellar college career at Tennessee before being drafted with a top 3 pick in the NFL draft. Unlike Peyton Manning, Shuler was a dreadful NFL quarterback who finished his career with just 15 touchdowns to 33 interceptions. He did manage to eke out a good game early in the 1997 season versus Detroit, though, where he threw for 202 yards, 1 touchdown, and a 117.6 rating, while also running for a touchdown in an 18-point win. That would be the high point of Shuler's time in New Orleans, as he'd finish his Saints career with 2 touchdowns and 14 interceptions. Yikes. Vince Young, Week 12, 2006 versus the Giants. Young had a truly weird NFL career. He won 62% of his starts and had a lot of game-winning drives, but he was a largely terrible quarterback who finished his career with 46 touchdowns to 51 interceptions. One of his famous comebacks was late in his rookie year versus the Giants, where he threw for 249 yards, 2 touchdowns, had a 107.9 rating, and 69 rushing yards and a touchdown. Nice. His team was down 21-0 to start the fourth quarter before he led them on a 24-0 fourth quarter run to win the game. Could Young have become a good NFL quarterback if he had a coach he liked instead of Jeff Fisher? We'll never know. Matt Barkley, Week 10, 2018 versus the Jets. Barkley was an incredibly hyped high school quarterback who put up monster stats at USC before being drafted in the 4th round by my Eagles in 2013. Barkley is still bouncing around the NFL, but he's had a very disappointing career, putting up career totals of just 11 touchdowns to 22 interceptions. However, for one day in 2018 versus the Jets, he balled out, putting up 2 touchdowns and no interceptions for a 117.4 rating and a 31-point win. Sure, it came against the Jets, which is like beating up a handicapped kid, but it still counts, goddammit. Andre Ware, Week 15, 1992 versus Cleveland. After winning the Heisman Trophy in 1989 at Houston, Ware was drafted 7th overall by Detroit in 1990 to give the team a potential star quarterback to pair with the incomparable Barry Sanders. Safe to say, the experiment failed big time, as in 4 years, Ware accounted for just 5 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. Somehow, though, Ware managed to fit in a good game in there. Late in 1992 versus Bill Belichick's Browns, he threw for 2 touchdowns with a 142.3 rating and also ran for 68 yards in a 10-point win. David Klingler, Week 17, 1993 versus Atlanta. Klingler followed Ware's footsteps at Houston, putting up monster numbers in their run-and-shoot offense. Unfortunately for the Bengals, who drafted him 6th overall in 1992, Klingler also followed Ware's footsteps in becoming a terrible pro quarterback. He finished his NFL career with 16 touchdowns to 22 interceptions, but of course, he's in this video because he had a good game at some point. In this instance, Week 17 in 1993 versus Atlanta. He threw for 3 touchdowns and ran for 36 yards in a 21-17 win over the Falcons. Tim Tebow, wildcard round 2011 versus Pittsburgh. Unlike most quarterbacks on this list, Tebow finished his NFL career with a positive touchdown-interception ratio, finishing with 17 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. But a large reason for his lack of interceptions is because his incompletions were usually so off-target, nobody had a chance to get them. But you already remember the game I'm picking. Tebow's infamous 2011 playoff win over the number 1 ranked defense Steelers. Tebow would throw for over 300 yards, 2 touchdowns, and ran for 50 yards and another touchdown, all capped off with an 80-yard game-winning touchdown pass in overtime. That's right, a scrub like Tebow has one of the best playoff performances ever by a quarterback. Go figure. Nathan Peterman, Week 14, 2017 versus Indianapolis. And finally, I couldn't make this list without including the infamous Nathan Peterman, a quarterback who is so bad it's almost impossible to believe he exists. In the most quarterback-friendly era ever, Peterman managed a career 3 touchdowns to 12 interceptions, but not even the Peterman's levels of sucker ineptitude are enough to stop him from having at least one semi-decent performance. That's right. Late in 2017 against the Colts, in a snowstorm, Peterman threw for a touchdown with no interceptions for a 100.8 rating in a 13-7 win. Was this truly a great performance? By Peterman standards, yes, and that's all that matters.